It is 1953. The air in Blackwood Parish, Alabama, is thick with the smell of pine dust and decay. The old parsonage, a two-story wooden tomb that has stood empty for nearly 80 years, is finally coming down. The church board decreed it an eyesore, a relic of a past they were eager to pave over. A crew of 3 men work with crowbars and sledgehammers, tearing away the brittle lath and plaster of the master bedroom. One of the men, a young war veteran named Harris, feels his crowbar punch through the rear wall of the main wardrobe. He expects to see daylight. Instead, he finds only more darkness. Another wall set back 3 feet, a hidden space. Cursing, he hammers the plaster, convinced it's a wasp nest, until the rotted wood gives way. The smell that pours out is ancient, a dry, metallic odor of rust and trapped air. Harris shines his flashlight into the black void. It is a room just large enough for a man to sit but not to stand. A dark stain covers the floorboards. A small tin cup lies on its side, green with verdigris, and bolted to the far wall, almost invisible in the dust, is a single heavy iron manacle, the chain coiled beneath it like a sleeping snake. Beside it, tucked into a hollow in the slats, is a small, leather-bound book. It is a diary. Harris wipes the grime from the cover. The gold leaf letters are faded but legible. Elara Holt. 1852, he opens it. The first page is not a prayer, it is a statement. I have decided to procure a creature, one for myself. The Reverend has his God, I shall have this. Harris sits back on his heels, the dust motes dancing in his beam, and realizes he has just unearthed a secret that Blackwood Parish had tried to bury alive. The diary of Elara Holt did not confess a crime, it boasted of a victory. Its pages, filled with a delicate, spidery script, were not the musings of a pious reverend's wife. They were the meticulous records of an obsession. Entry after entry speaks not of faith but of possession. The bell tolls, she writes. The congregation gathers. They turn their eyes to my husband and he gives them God, but I have a secret. When the hymns begin, I have my own choir, a choir of one. It sings for me from the dark, and it is the only honest sound in this entire town. The diary mentions no name. It refers to its subject only as it, or my pet, or the creature. Harris, the demolition man, turned the book over to the County Historical Society. The historians were baffled. They knew of Reverend Thaddeus Holt, the famed orator of the 1850s, but his wife, Elara, was a footnote, a woman who had supposedly gone mad and been sent away. This diary painted a different picture. It was the work of a mind that was not fractured but terrifyingly clear. It was a blueprint for the systematic dehumanization of a human being. The historians cross-referenced the dates, the parish records, the bills of sale. And slowly, a story emerged from the archives. A story of a town drowning in public piety and a private hell constructed inside the very walls of its holy house. The secret began, as all such secrets do, not with a bang, but with a whisper. It began with the arrival of a man who would be erased from history, and the woman who decided to own his very soul. To understand what happened in that room, you must first understand the place that built it. Blackwood Parish, Alabama, 1852. This was not a town, it was a fortress of righteousness built on a foundation of human suffering. Its economy was cotton, its God was prophet, and its law was the word of one man, Reverend Thaddeus Holt. The town's skyline was dominated by the white steeple of his church, a gleaming white spear aimed at the heavens. But that piety was a mask. Blackwood was a place of crushing, suffocating judgment. Every word was weighed, every action scrutinized. Women walked with their eyes down. Men spoke in hushed tones until Sunday, when they gathered to hear the Reverend condemn the world outside their borders. It was a town where everyone knew their place. The plantation owner, the overseer, the poor white farmer. And at the very bottom, the enslaved men and women who powered the entire machine, visible in the fields and kitchens, but invisible to the town's conscience. Before we step back into this world, a world that buried its darkest secrets just beneath the floorboards, I want to know where you are watching from. What city, state, or country? Leave a comment below. It is fascinating to see how far these hidden stories travel. The people of Blackwood believed their town was an island of moral purity. But the truth is, A mask held up that long eventually fuses with the skin. And in 1852, the mask was about to crack. Reverend Thaddeus Holt was a giant, not in stature but in presence. When he stood at the pulpit, his voice did not merely fill the church, it seemed to shake the very foundations. He was an orator of the Old Testament, a man who spoke of hellfire, brimstone, and damnation, with such vivid, terrifying clarity that women fainted in the pews. His sermons were the event of the week, lasting 3, sometimes 4 hours. They were masterpieces of psychological theater, breaking down the congregation with fear and then, only at the very end, offering the slim, narrow path to salvation. To the town, he was a pillar of unbending iron. His word was law, his judgment final. He was consulted on business deals, property disputes, and the meting out of justice, which was often swift and brutal. But the man who controlled every soul in Blackwood Parish had no control over his own home. The parsonage, set back from the road, was not a place of warmth. It was a place of cold duty. Thaddeus Holt did not see a wife. He saw a necessary component of his station. He gave her his name, his protection, and his absolute, chilling indifference. He was a man who preached to thousands, but never spoke to the one person who slept beside him. He demanded purity from his town, but he never once thought to look inside his own house, or at the woman who was slowly being eaten alive by the silence. Her name was Elara Holt, and she was the perfect reverend's wife. She was from a once wealthy Charleston family, given to Thaddeus in a match designed to secure her family's ailing finances and his social standing. She was beautiful in the way a porcelain doll is beautiful, pale, fragile, and utterly lifeless. She was childless. After 2 miscarriages in the first 3 years of marriage, the doctor had declared her barren, and Thaddeus had accepted the news with the same cold finality as a failed crop. From that moment, Elara ceased to be a wife and became simply a fixture. She drifted through the large, dark rooms of the parsonage like a ghost, managing the household servants, sitting in the front pew on Sunday and smiling wanly when the ladies of the parish praised her devotion. But inside, a void had opened up. It was a hunger born of profound isolation. She was a possession, no different from the polished silverware or the horse in the stable. She had no power, no voice, no purpose. And in the suffocating piety of Blackwood, where her every move was watched, that void began to curdle into something dark. She didn't want freedom. She didn't want love. She wanted what her husband had. She wanted control. She wanted a soul to knead in her hands. She wanted a creature. And in the spring of 1852, one arrived. In the spring of 1852, Reverend Holt attended an estate sale at the bankrupt Sinclair plantation. He returned not with furniture but with assets. 3 new souls to serve the parsonage, their papers of ownership signed and filed with the county clerk. 2 were women, assigned to the kitchen and laundry, but the 3rd was a man named Cato. He was young, perhaps 20, with a strong back and hands that were calloused but careful. His previous owner noted that he was docile but prone to melancholy, a euphemism for a spirit that had not yet been fully broken. Cato had one defining feature: his voice. In the fields, he would sing deep, resonant hymns that carried over the cotton rows, songs of deliverance and sorrow that seemed to hang in the humid air. It was a sound of defiant humanity. The Reverend, finding the sound distracting, assigned him to the house and grounds, believing the civilizing influence of the parsonage would quiet him. Cato was to tend the garden, maintain the stable, and be on call for any heavy lifting within the house. This decision, this simple domestic reassignment, was a death sentence. It moved him from the relative anonymity of the fields to the focused, sterile environment of the house. It brought him into the suffocating quiet of the parsonage, directly into the orbit of its silent mistress. Elara Holt began to watch him. At first, it was from her upstairs window, a fleeting glance as he split firewood or drew water from the well. Then it became an occupation. She would sit in the parlor for hours, pretending to read, but her attention was fixed on the man moving through the garden. She studied him like a scholar studies a text, learning his rhythms, his habits. She noted the way he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, The way he would sometimes look up at the steeple, his expression unreadable. But it was the sound of his humming that captivated her. He didn't sing openly, not here, but a low, mournful tune would rumble in his chest as he worked. It was his. It was the last piece of his soul that the world had not touched, a private, internal freedom. And Elara, in her profound and twisted emptiness, could not stand it. It was not desire she felt. It was not attraction. It was the cold, reptilian urge of a collector. She saw his spirit, that last flickering ember of self, and she wanted to put it in a jar. She wanted to be the only one who could hear it, the only one who could command it, the only one who could snuff it out. Her husband owned his body, but she woo. LD owned his mind. She had found her creature, and she would sooner die than let it remain free. The plan took shape not as a storm, but as a slow, creeping fog. It grew from the architecture of her own life. Every Sunday her husband, Thaddeus, became a god. He stood before the town and his voice remade the world. For 3 hours his power was absolute. And in that, Elara saw her own opportunity. She too would have a congregation. She too would hold a life in the palm of her hand. Her gaze fell upon the wardrobe in her bedroom. It was a monstrous piece of furniture, a wedding gift from her Charleston family, carved from dark mahogany, tall as a man and twice as wide. It was so heavy that it had been built in the room and would never leave. The town's cabinet maker had, in a fit of pride, boasted that it was as solid as a crypt. Elara had laughed at the description. Now she saw its potential. It was deep. The back was flush against the wall, or so it seemed. She had found the loose panel years ago during a fit of cleaning, a small, dark alcove behind it, likely a structural quirk, a space of dead air. It was perhaps 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide. An empty black rectangle right in the heart of the house. It was a coffin standing upright. It was a womb. It was a church. The wardrobe was no longer furniture. It was a cathedral, and she was ready to consecrate it. The first Sunday in June arrived, hot and breathless. The church bell began to toll at precisely 10 o'clock. The sound, a heavy iron clang, was the signal. It was the sound of the town emptying, of all eyes turning toward the steeple. Reverend Holt, dressed in his severe black suit, gave Elara a curt nod. "I trust your headache will pass, my dear," he said. "Pray for guidance." She had feigned a migraine, a common occurrence that he no longer questioned. He left. She watched from the window as he strode toward the church. Then came the servants. Delia and Sarah, the 2 housemaids, their heads covered, walking 20 paces behind him. The entire white population of Blackwood was moving, a slow river of starched collars and wide-brimmed hats, all flowing to the church. The parsonage became an island of perfect, humming silence. The house was empty. Empty, save for her, and for Cato, who was at that moment cleaning the ashes from the kitchen hearth. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear, but with a giddy, terrifying anticipation. This was the moment. The power her husband felt at the pulpit, she felt it now, alone in her house. Elara Holt stood by the upstairs window, a small silver key clutched in her hand. It was time. She called his name from the top of the stairs. "Cato." Her voice was calm, almost sweet. He appeared at the bottom, his face smudged with soot, his eyes downcast. "Ma'am," he was forbidden from the 2nd floor unless accompanied by the Reverend. "I require your assistance in my room," Elara said, her tone light as if asking for a glass of water. "The latch on my wardrobe is stuck. It requires a man's strength." Cato's head jerked up slightly. The mistress's bedroom. A wave of ice-cold fear washed over him. This was a trap. 1,000 stories of men accused, whipped, or sold for less flashed through his mind. "Ma'am, I ain't supposed to. Are you disobeying me, Cato?" Her voice was still soft, but a steel edge had appeared. "The Reverend is at the pulpit. There is no one here but us. It will take but a moment." He had no choice. To refuse was an act of defiance, and the punishment for that was certain. To obey was a risk, but it was the only option. He ascended the stairs slowly, each step a heavy weight. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands clasped behind his back, as if to prove he had no ill intent. She led him into the master bedroom, the air thick with the scent of lavender and old books. She pointed to the enormous mahogany wardrobe. "The inside latch," she whispered. "It's binding. I believe a panel is loose." He was standing just inches from the heavy oak door. and he had no idea he was on the edge of his own grave. Inside the box, time dissolved. The darkness was not just an absence of light, it was a physical weight. It pressed in on him, thick and suffocating, smelling of old wool, cedar, and Elara's lavender sachets. At first he would sit, his knees drawn to his chest, trying to regulate his breath, fighting the panic that clawed at his throat. He would try to pray, but the words felt hollow, swallowed by the suffocating velvet blackness. After the first few Sundays, the psychological torment began to take root. He would lose all sense of up or down. The stale air grew hot and thin, and he would gasp, convinced the walls were shrinking, that the box was crushing him. He would run his hands over the smooth wood again and again, just to prove to himself that the space was real. He began to hallucinate. He would see flashes of light, hear whispers that were Elara's. He would dream of the open fields, only to wake up, his face pressed against the hard wooden back of the wardrobe. The only sound that punctured his prison was the distant, muffled boom of the Reverend's voice from the church, a meaningless thunder. And then the bell. The bell was his tormentor. The first bell sealed him in. The last, the one that dismissed the congregation, was the sound of his resurrection. He lived his entire week in the shadow of those bells, a man chained to the rhythm of a clock he could not see. There was another person in the parsonage who saw the world through watchful eyes. Her name was Delia. She was the senior housemaid, a woman in her 40s who had been in the Reverend's service for a decade. Delia had survived by being invisible and observant. She knew every secret in the house. She knew where the Reverend kept his hidden bottle of brandy. She knew the merchants who overcharged the church, and she knew that Mistress Holt was not simply frail. She was something else, something cold. Delia was the first to notice the change. The mistress's Sunday migraines had vanished. In their place on that one day she was energized, almost vibrant. Her pale cheeks would have a flush of color, her eyes a disturbing sparkle. Delia also noticed the change in Cato. The young man who had arrived with a quiet pride was now a walking shadow. He had lost weight. He had a persistent, hacking cough from the dust and stale air. But most of all, it was his eyes. They were the eyes of a man perpetually braced for a blow. And Delia saw how he reacted when the mistress entered a room. He would freeze, sometimes visibly trembling before making himself scarce. Delia knew the brutal mathematics of a house like this. She had seen this dynamic before. But she, like everyone else, assumed the Reverend was the source of his terror. She was wrong. The first piece of the puzzle fell into place on a Monday. Delia was cleaning the master bedroom, a task she performed with meticulous care. As she swept behind the heavy dressing table near the wardrobe, her broom hit something. It was a plate. Not a servant's tin plate, but the mistress's fine porcelain. On it was a congealed, untouched portion of Sunday's dinner, roasted chicken, biscuits, and preserves. Delia froze. Servants were never, ever allowed to eat from the master's plates. Cato would never be so bold, so foolish. Why would the mistress hide her own dinner? It made no sense. Then, a few days later, another discrepancy. Elara always requested a full pitcher of fresh water by her bedside every morning. But on Sunday nights, when Delia came to turn down the bed, the pitcher was nearly empty. Yet Delia had never once seen the mistress drink more than a polite sip. It was as if she were hydrating two people. Delia stood in the silent bedroom, looking from the heavy water pitcher to the spot where she had found the plate. Her gaze drifted to the massive, ornate wardrobe. It stood silent, guarding its secrets. Delia felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She knew something was wrong, but she could not yet give the horror a name. Elara's obsession was evolving. The simple act of caging him was no longer enough. The god of this tiny, dark world needed to be worshipped. She needed her creature to not just fear her, but to need her. Her cruelty became laced with a grotesque and terrifying intimacy. She began leaving gifts for him inside the wardrobe. The first was a pillow tossed into the darkness. "So you might be comfortable," she whispered through the keyhole. Cato, huddling inside, was horrified. It wasn't kindness, it was a furnishing of the cage. The next week it was a thick wool blanket. "The nights are growing cold," she cooed. She was making it a home, she was making it permanent. She brought him the pitcher of water, commanding him to drink it all. She left him plates of food which he, in his terror and claustrophobia, could not eat. The sight of the untouched food when she let him out would send her into a quiet rage. "Ungracious," she would hiss. "Do you not see how I am caring for you?" But the most depraved gift came on a Sunday in July. She tossed in a small, leather-bound hymn book. "You must be so lonely in there," she whispered. "Now you can sing praises with the rest of us." It was a taunt of unimaginable cruelty. She knew he could not read, and even if he could, there was not a single ray of light to see the words. She was not just breaking his body, she was mocking his soul. Reverend Thaddeus Holt was a man obsessed with the sins of others, which made him blind to the sins within his own walls. But he was not a fool. He, too, noticed the changes in his household. He noticed that his wife, once so listless, now seemed to possess a vibrant, secret life. She was defiant in small ways, meeting his gaze with a confidence that bordered on insolence. He mistook her newfound power for returning health, and it pleased him. But the change in Cato was more troubling. The man was becoming useless. He dropped tools. He started at shadows. He fumbled simple commands. Once when the Reverend clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of almost unheard-of familiarity, Cato had flinched so violently he fell to his knees. The Reverend was annoyed. He saw it as a flaw in the property he had purchased. He confronted Elara. "The boy Cato is unwell," he stated over dinner. "He is jumpy and consumptive. Perhaps your ministrations in the house are too taxing for him. He should return to the fields." Elara's spoon paused over her soup. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with a sudden animal panic. "No," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. He is clumsy, but he is learning. Delia needs the help." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. He had never heard his wife use that tone of command. He let the matter drop, but a seed of suspicion had been planted. He had seen that look of possession before. But he had seen it in the eyes of men at a gambling table, not in the face of his pious wife. Cato's body began to betray him. The weekly hours spent in the cramped, airless void were taking a permanent toll. The dust, thick with cedar shavings and particles of dried lavender, had settled in his lungs, and the hacking cough he developed was now a constant, racking affliction. He was in a state of perpetual twilight, his mind blurred by oxygen deprivation and terror. The darkness in the wardrobe was no longer just an absence of light. It was a living thing. It had a texture. It had a sound. He began to hallucinate, seeing the faces of his family in the grain of the wood, hearing whispers that were not Elara's. He started to talk back to them, his voice a dry rasp. "I'm here," he would whisper. "I'm still here." Sometimes, in a fit of despair, his whispers would become a low, animal keen, a sound of pure, undiluted misery. This was a new, dangerous complication for Elara. Her creature was becoming loud. Her control, which had been so absolute, was now threatened by the very breakdown she had engineered. She couldn't risk the Reverend or Delia hearing him. Her response was swift. She no longer spoke through the keyhole. She would unlock the door just a crack, her face a mask of cold fury in the sliver of light. "Be silent," she would hiss, her voice more venomous than any whip. "If you make a sound, he will find you. Do you know what he will do? He will say you attacked me. He will say you forced your way in here. He will have you burned. Be silent, or you will burn." And so, Cato was trapped in a new, more exquisite hell. He was trapped between the madness of the box and the terror of discovery. His body was giving out, his mind was fracturing, and his only keeper was the very person destroying him. Delia had to know. The suspicion was eating her alive. The missing food, the empty water pitcher, Cato's visible decline, and the mistress's vibrating, manic energy every Sunday. It was a constellation of facts that pointed to a truth she could not yet see. The following Sunday, the bell tolled for the 10 o'clock service. Reverend Holt left. Elara, as usual, clutched her head, complaining of the vapors. As Delia prepared to leave for the service, she feigned a dizzy spell, collapsing onto a kitchen chair. "I can't, ma'am," she breathed. "The heat. I think I'm faint." Elara's eyes narrowed. For a second, Delia saw a flash of pure, calculating anger, but the mistress recovered quickly. "Very well, Delia, rest in your cot. Do not disturb me." It was the permission Delia needed. The house fell silent, but Delia did not go to her cot. She slipped off her shoes, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. She crept up the back stairs, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She moved down the upstairs hall, a ghost in her own house. She didn't dare go near the door. Instead, she hid in the small linen alcove opposite the master bedroom, a spot that gave her a narrow, diagonal view of the wardrobe. She waited. 1 minute, 5. Then she heard it, the faint jingle of a key, the heavy, expensive snick of the lock, the slow, deep groan of the wardrobe door opening. Elara's voice, low and commanding. "Drink, now." And then Delia saw it. From the blackness of the wardrobe, a hand emerged. A skeletal, trembling hand. It was not the hand of a lover. It was the hand of a prisoner. Delia watched, paralyzed by a horror beyond her comprehension, as Elara passed a cup to the shadow in her closet. Delia fled. She stumbled back to her cot, her mind screaming. She pulled the thin blanket over her head, but she could not block out the image. The hand, Cato's hand, reaching from the darkness, not in passion but in desperation. All the pieces clicked into place. The food, the water, the cough, the terror. The mistress was not having an affair. She was not hiding a lover. She was keeping him, like a spider keeps a fly. She was feeding him just enough to keep him alive in a box just ds from where the Reverend slept. Delia was now the sole witness to a sin so profound, so monstrous she had no name for it. And with that knowledge came a terrible, paralyzing dilemma. What could she do? If she went to the Reverend, what would she say? "Sir, your wife is keeping Cato in her wardrobe." Holt, in his righteous fury, would not see a victim. He would see only a black man in his wife's private room. He would assume defilement. He would drag Cato from that box and have him hanged from the nearest oak before the sun set. And what of Delia? For allowing such a thing, for knowing and not speaking, she would be seen as an accomplice. She would be whipped, sold south, or worse. Her life would be over. Her only other option was to stay silent, to go on day after day, sweeping the floors and changing the linens, knowing that a man was suffocating, dying just one wall away, to be complicit in his living burial. There was no one to tell. There was no law to appeal to. The entire world was designed to protect Elara Holt and to destroy Cato and anyone who tried to help him. Delia was trapped. For Cato, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of the wardrobe, but one Sunday something in him broke. It may have been the delirium, the thirst, or simply the last primal spark of a soul that refused to be extinguished. He had been in the box for hours, the air burning his lungs. He heard the final church bell, the signal that the town was returning to life. He heard the key in the lock, and he did not wait for the command to drink. The moment the door cracked open, he lunged. It was not a plan. It was an explosion. With a desperate animal howl, he threw his entire weakened body against the heavy door. He burst out of the darkness and into the sunlit bedroom, a creature of rags and shadows. He fell to the floor, gasping, blinking against the agonizing light, his limbs tangled, his mind on fire. Elara was thrown backward, shrieking not in fear but in pure, blasphemed rage. Her creature had defied her. Her pet had tried to escape its cage. For a single, frozen moment, Cato was free. He scrambled on his hands and knees toward the hallway, toward the air, toward life. But he was too weak. He had forgotten the strength of his own jailer. Elara, fueled by a terrifying, cold fury, was on him in an instant. She didn't hit him. She simply shoved him hard. He was so light, so brittle, that he collapsed, his head cracking against the brass foot of the bed. He lay there, stunned and sobbing, the escape attempt lasting less than 10 seconds. Elara stood over him, her chest heaving, her silk robe undone. The game was over. He had broken the rules, and now he would learn what real chains felt like. His defiance had changed the equation. Elara's brief flicker of panic was replaced by a chilling, methodical resolve. Her pet was ungrateful. It was disobedient. It could not be trusted with the illusion of freedom. The lock on the door was no longer enough. She grabbed Cato by the hair and dragged him, dazed and bleeding, back into the wardrobe. He was too weak to fight, his last burst of adrenaline spent. She slammed the door, locked it, and then locked her bedroom. She walked calmly to the old smokehouse, a relic from the property's previous owners. She knew what was there: rusted traps, old bridles, and in a dark corner a set of tools used for difficult property. She returned with a heavy iron manacle, a length of chain, a hammer, and a thick iron bolt. She opened the wardrobe. Cato shrank back, his eyes wide with a new, final terror when he saw the objects in her hands. "No," he whispered. "Please, mistress, no." His plea was meaningless. It was like a rabbit pleading with a hawk. She ordered him to put his ankle against the back wall. He refused, curling into a ball. Elara didn't argue. She simply raised the hammer. He understood. Sobbing, he uncurled and pressed his foot to the wood. The sound of the hammer striking the bolt was deafening in the quiet house. Bang, 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 a brutal metallic rhythm. She was nailing him to the very structure of the parsonage. She looped the chain, fastened the shackle around his ankle, and clicked it shut. It was done. He could no longer stand. He could no longer lunge. He was now and forever a fixture. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Cato's hoarse, agonizing gasps as the fresh air hit his lungs. Reverend Thaddeus Holt stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of colliding, unprocessable thoughts. He saw the filth. He saw the empty tin cup. He saw the hymn book lying in the corner. He saw the iron bolt, a crude, brutal violation hammered into the very wall of his home. He saw his wife Elara slowly pulling herself up, her face no longer terrified but cold, watchful, and strangely triumphant. "You see," she whispered, a strange, proud smile touching her lips. "He is mine. I kept him, just like you keep your congregation." That one sentence, that boast, was the spark that lit the fuse. The Reverend's paralysis shattered. The horror, the confusion, it all clarified and collapsed into one simple, volcanic emotion: rage. A rage so pure and biblical it was a living thing. But his rage was not and could never be for his wife. To admit her sin, her monstrous, calculated cruelty, would be to admit his own failure. It would mean he had been fooled. It would mean his house was a pit of depravity. The patriarchal order of his entire world, the very foundation of his power, would not allow it. The sin had to be Cato's. The serpent had to be the one in chains. "Abomination," the Reverend roared, but he was not looking at his wife. He was looking at Cato. He lunged into the wardrobe, grabbed the front of Cato's rags, and dragged him out into the light. Cato was so weak he could not even stand. He collapsed onto the floor, a tangle of limbs and chain. "You, filth," Holt bellowed. You dare to hide in my wife's room, you attack her, you defile my home." Cato, delirious and blinded by the light, could only whimper. He had no idea what was happening, who this new tormentor was. Elara, seeing the narrative shift, seeing her husband's desperate, self-serving lie, instantly understood. She ran to him, clutching his arm, and began to sob, the perfect theatrical sobs of a victim. "Oh, Thaddeus," she cried. It was horrible. He forced me. He's been hiding in there for weeks. He threatened to kill me if I told." It was a brilliant, instantaneous pivot. She was no longer the jailer, she was the prisoner. She was not the monster, she was the victim. Thaddeus seized the new story like a drowning man seizing a rope. This made sense. This was a story the world would understand. A wicked, lustful beast and a pure, terrified woman. He turned to his weeping wife, his face a mask of terrible, righteous fury. "I will handle this." He turned back to Cato, his eyes devoid of all mercy. "You will answer to God." He unbolted the chain from the wall with 3 furious yanks, tearing a chunk of plaster with it. He dragged Cato, who was little more than a skeleton, down the stairs and out onto the front lawn of the parsonage. The congregation, just released from the church, was milling about, confused by the short service. They saw their reverend, his face like thunder, dragging the barely conscious form of the enslaved man. Elara followed, weeping, her hair unbound, a perfect portrait of damsel in distress. "He attacked my wife," Holt roared, his voice carrying across the parish green. "This beast was found hiding in her wardrobe. He has been there for weeks, threatening her, defiling my home." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was their deepest, darkest fear realized. The serpent in the garden, the wolf in the fold. Delia, standing on the edge of the crowd, felt her blood run cold. She saw the lie clear as day. She saw Elara's cold, triumphant eyes behind her fake tears. She saw Cato, his ankle raw and bloody from the manacle. But as the men of the town began to circle, their faces darkening, Delia knew the truth was a luxury no one could afford. The town doctor pushed through. "He's nearly dead," he said, examining Cato. "He's starved." "He did it to himself," Elara shrieked. "He refused to come out. He is possessed." That was the word they needed, possessed. The town's justice was swift. There was no trial, there was no defense. Cato, too weak to speak, to deny, to even understand, was pronounced guilty by the roar of the mob. Cato's fate was sealed. He was hanged from the great oak tree on the parish green, the same tree where picnics were held. The Reverend himself led the prayer as the body was cut down, thanking God for delivering his wife from the shadow of unspeakable evil. The aftermath was swift and brutally efficient. The truth was buried and the lie was sanctified. Elara Holt, having played her part as the terrified victim, was now a problem. She had suffered an ordeal so profound that her frail mind had snapped. That was the new story. It was more comfortable than the truth. It preserved the Reverend's dignity and explained away any inconsistencies. Within a month, Reverend Thaddeus Holt had his wife quietly committed to an asylum in Virginia. She was declared mentally frail, suffering from delusions brought on by her trauma. She left Blackwood in a private carriage and was never seen in Alabama again. Cato was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the cotton fields. His name was stricken from the parish records. He had, in effect, never existed. The official narrative was simple. A disturbed slave had attacked the Reverend's wife and had met with swift, righteous justice. The town, the church, and the Reverend could all agree on this. It was clean, it was simple, and it was a lie. Back in the parsonage, Reverend Holt took a hammer and nails and sealed the small alcove himself. He patched the plaster and pushed the heavy, scarred wardrobe back into place, covering the evidence of his home's profound sickness. The next Sunday, he returned to the pulpit. His voice was stronger than ever. His fever was gone. He delivered a 3-hour sermon on the nature of evil, on the devil who walks in plain sight, who can infiltrate even the most godly of homes. He spoke of the serpent who had tried to poison his Eden. The congregation wept. They had never felt closer to their Reverend, never felt more protected by his iron will. He had faced the devil and cast him out. The secret was safe. The silence was restored. Delia, sitting in the back pew, knew the truth. She knew the serpent hadn't been dragged from the wardrobe. The serpent was standing at the pulpit, and its accomplice had been sent away in a carriage. Delia would keep this secret for 50 years, telling it only once on her deathbed to her granddaughter. It was a story that would be passed down in whispers, a ghost story that the demolition crew in 1953 would finally, unknowingly, prove was true. We return to 1953, to the dusty, hidden room, to the demolition worker Harris holding the small leather-bound diary. He turns to the final entry written in a shaky, angry hand. It must have been penned from the asylum, smuggled out and hidden years later by an unknown accomplice. It was not the writing of a mad woman. It was the writing of a furious one. "He found my perfect, secret thing," Elara wrote. "My creature, the one soul in this world that was mine. He could not stand that I had a power equal to his. He could not stand that I had a God of my own, so he broke it. He took it from me and claimed it as his own victory. He is a thief. He stole my sin. It was the only thing I ever truly possessed." The historians who read that final page understood. The story was never about love. It was not an affair. It was not even about madness, not in the way the town believed. It was about power. In a world that gave her nothing, Elara Holt had forged a kingdom in a box. It was a story of the ultimate, horrifying expression of ownership in a system that defined people as property. The parsonage in Blackwood, Alabama, was torn down. A parking lot now covers the ground where it stood. But the diary of Elara Holt and the rusted manacle remain in the county archives, a quiet, sickening testament to the truth. The story of the Reverend's wife and the man in her wardrobe is not a ghost story. It is a story of the terrifying darkness that can flourish in the most pious of places, a darkness that thrives in silence. What do you think? Was this an isolated act of a deeply disturbed woman? Or was it the inevitable, monstrous child of a system built on absolute power and the complete dehumanization of others? Let me know your theories in the comments below. The secrets we bury in the walls of our history almost always find a way out. And the most terrifying monsters are not those who hide in the shadows, but those who preach from the pulpit. If you want to uncover more of America's darkest, most macabre mysteries, Be sure to hit that subscribe button for Macabre Mysteries of America. Thank you for watching. /